In this particular video, I'm going to be discussing Timothy Jones. Timothy Jones murdered his 5 children. This is a disturbing case with bizarre and dark behaviour. Hi, my name is Dr. Catherine Hughes from Crime Psych. I'm a criminal psychologist. I've done a number of these psychological analysis videos before where I take a look at a particular offender and then take a look at the psychology behind their actions. I do draw on research finding to give an informed opinion of what an offender's behaviour can reveal about their psychology. Just as a reminder, this isn't a diagnosis. In this particular video, I'm going to be discussing Timothy Jones. Timothy Jones murdered his 5 children. Many thanks to Kimberly Moeller for suggesting this case for an analysis today. This is a disturbing case with bizarre and dark behaviour. In all of my videos, I do try to focus more on the psychology of the behaviour, but it is sometimes necessary to include some details of the crime. This video contains details of drug and alcohol addiction, physical and mental abuse of children, domestic abuse and murder. As always, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the case and the offender, then I'll talk about the upbringing and the childhood of the offender, because that can sometimes give us some insights into why they behave in the way that they do. And then I'll move on to discuss the behaviours during the crime that reveal psychological aspects of the offender, as well as any psychiatric or mental illnesses that they have been diagnosed with. If you do want to learn more about the psychology of crime and criminal behaviour, there are a number of courses available online on my website, and there's a link in the video description. Timothy Jones strangled his 5 children and then drove around with them in the back of his car for 9 days before being arrested. Timothy had experienced a troubled childhood, which eventually led to him using drugs and alcohol. He became deeply religious and he had a prestigious, well-paid job at a computer company. His marriage fell apart and so did his life. He used physical punishments on his children and he had been reported to authorities several times. At his trial, he claimed to have undiagnosed schizophrenia and had demonic voices in his head. He was found guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Timothy Jones's childhood can only be described as being traumatic. During the trial of Timothy Jones, a social worker testified on the background of his family history. The social worker, Deborah Gray, said that there were 3 generations of rapes, molestation, violence, drugs, voodoo rituals and prostitution. The father, Timothy Jones Sr., was born as a result of his grandmother being raped by his stepfather. Jones's mother was mentally ill and was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. His mother, Cynthia Turner, had suffered years of abuse and trauma. Psychiatric records show that in her earlier years that she'd claimed she was locked in a closet with a dead chicken dripping blood on her, and that was by her voodoo-obsessed father. It seems likely that she developed this schizophrenia as a coping mechanism. Timothy's mother had been living in a psychiatric facility for many years. She never wanted a fat baby when Timothy was born, so she refused to feed him. She fed him laxatives to cleanse his body. She plunged him into baths of cold water where he screamed and cried. She sat alone in a closet, cutting up her clothes. Timothy watched as his mother's mental health spiralled out of control, and that eventually led to her requiring around-the-clock care. As a child, Timothy's mother left home to be a prostitute. His family didn't tell him that she was sick, just that she wasn't around. Timothy's father moved into his mother's house with his youngest son. However, he was then exposed to domestic violence, drug and alcohol use. So far, Timothy Jones's upbringing had been chaotic and abusive. But this didn't seem to have an impact on how intelligent he was, and he was skilled with numbers and decoded mathematical problems quite easily. He even took a computer apart and reassembled it to run faster and better when he was a child. He had this natural ability with mathematics, and he had a very analytical mind. However, by the age of 10, he began to exhibit behavioural problems. He told a psychiatrist he first heard voices when he was 10 years old. At 12, he started smoking marijuana. By high school, he'd become a heavy drinker. This indicates to me that he wasn't able to cope with life on life's terms. Whenever somebody uses drugs or alcohol, they're commonly using them to ease the pain of some internal mental difficulties. When a child gets to this age, they're beginning to understand what's happening around them and what's normal, and they can compare themselves to their peers. The prefrontal cortex in the brain is still forming, and that's the area responsible for controlling behaviour and critical thinking. At the age of 15, he was involved in a serious car crash. It left him with part of his skull broken and affected his frontal lobe. That area of the brain controls impulses. His behaviour then became more erratic, it became more aggressive and reactive as a result, and he was extremely jealous of anyone that his father paid attention to. His father did remarry, and as a result, Timothy felt somewhat abandoned and unloved by him. It had been reported that the dad feared that he would turn out like his mother. His father claimed that although he was clearly intelligent, he lacked empathy, common sense, and emotional intelligence. After high school, Timothy aspired to join the Navy SEALs. However, he only lasted a very short time in boot camp and was frequently found crying alone. He was given a general discharge for substance abuse and depression. His problems carried on from that point. It's likely to be a combination of a propensity towards mental illness, brain damage, and dysfunctional experiences and the abuse, which would have been exacerbated by that brain damage. So when he returned home, he hung out with a crowd who drank and partied and smoked marijuana. That led to an interaction with police that led to him being prosecuted for possession of cocaine, car theft and fraud. He was jailed for a year, and after returning home, he found comfort in religion. He embraced religion, and he found comfort in the structure, acceptance and love of that. He'd read and quote Bible passages, which he took literally. He hadn't had any power or control over his chaotic childhood, which may have been one of the main reasons he was drawn to the church, because of its rigid structure. He then met Amber, whom he married and went on to have children with. He introduced her to the Pentecostal church. He took the church rules and expectations as being law. It expected couples to marry right away, which they did. They were both still very young. He was 22 and Amber was 19. Amber soon learned that the church had very strict rules. Women weren't allowed to cut their hair. They couldn't wear pants. They couldn't wear makeup or jewellery. At the time of his trial, she told the jury, Tim's motto was, a woman is supposed to be fruitful and multiply. A woman is supposed to listen to her husband. Timothy Jones threw himself into the faith, praying in tongues in church and disciplining his children with beatings, because he believed that the Bible clearly instructed in the 23rd chapter of the Proverbs to do so. He believed that punishment was good for children, because the Bible said, withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with a rod, he shall not die. He ignored what many people had been telling him for years, that he shouldn't take everything in the Bible literally. I personally think that he did find comfort in the structure and the strict rules of the church. His life before that had been chaotic and manageable. There were no grey areas within the church, and he probably saw it as a blueprint of how to live a good life. The couple went on to graduate university whilst married and whilst bringing up children, as well as working several jobs at the time. So outwardly, Timothy Jones was living a good family life and was offered a prestigious job at a computer software company. Amber expected once he'd gained a promotion that they could move to a bigger house and hire a nanny. However, Timothy chose to move to a ramshackle trailer where he set up a small holding with several animals. Amber was then expected to stay home and look after the animals and children while Timothy went out to work. She was also expected to homeschool them. She lived a very isolated, cut-off life. She was very cut off from any sources of support. The overwhelming pressure then led to her having an affair with a neighbour. That was the start of the chain of events that led to the murder of the 5 children. During their final months together, Timothy knocked Amber's back teeth out when he threw a phone at her. He headbutted her, spat on her in front of the children, and headbutted her unconscious, according to the testimony that was given at his trial. Timothy was awarded custody of the children following the breakdown of his marriage. The only reason for this was because Amber, Timothy's wife, couldn't afford for a lawyer to argue her case that she should have the children. Mentally, Jones was spiralling out of control. He'd started using drugs and drinking again. He was wrestling with voices in his head. He later told psychiatrists that he was wrestling with voices in his head. As time went by, Jones became increasingly angry about little things, about minor things. And this indicates to me that he was increasingly feeling like he had no control over his life anymore. The rigid structure and the rules of the church couldn't help him at this stage, and he was losing the facade of a happy marriage as well. A succession of babysitters testified that he kept his home nice and he was a loving father. One of these babysitters was aged just 17 and became his living lover. She had a young daughter who also moved in with them. As before, Timothy Jones introduced her to the church and began insisting on her wearing long dresses, growing her hair out, and of course being subservient to him. She testified in court that he would hit the children pretty hard and make them stand tippy-toe in the corner. He believed that spankings and corporal punishment was medicine for their sick bodies. The final straw for her was when she found him preparing to whip her infant daughter, and she left. The next babysitter also became increasingly worried for the children's welfare and safety, as well as the state of their home, because at that stage there was rubbish and there were dirty clothes all over the floor and there were cockroaches all over the place. Jones continued with his brutal punishments towards the children and formed a habit of feeding the children nothing but oatmeal all day. Once, before that babysitter had left for the day, she said that the children asked, "Could you not tell Daddy you just fed us because he might not feed us again?" She did report him to the authorities. At the same time, the children's school had also reported it to social services a few months earlier about their concerns. As a result, Jones had to agree to make a written promise to never spank or beat the children again. This seems like a complete brush-off to me, if I'm honest. Those children were being abused. They were at risk of physical harm by their father, and all he was required to do was to sign a bit of paper. It seems odd that there were no follow-ups done with the children or with the school to ensure that that abuse had then stopped. I mean, which authority was Timothy Jones more likely to listen to? One that gave him meaning and structure and put him in a position of power, giving clear guidelines and expectations, or some government department that he had no prior involvement with or respect for? On the evening of the 18th of August 2014, one of the children had broken an electrical outlet at home. Some reports say that the child had also said that he wanted to live with his mother. So, as a punishment, Jones made him do strenuous exercise for some time. Jones claims that he sent the child to bed, and when he checked on him some time later, he was dead. This was the story that he told during his police interview. However, 2 correctional officers who were present when he was being processed into the prison after his arrest claim that he told him that he strangled the child, but because his hands were too big, he used a belt. Whilst he was strangling them, one of his daughters walked in. He said that he'd gotten angry with Nathan for crying and saying that he wanted to be with his mother, so Jones strangled him in a fit of rage. And when his daughter walked in on him, he decided that he needed to kill her too. This guard said that Timothy Jones had said that he felt that he had to kill the other children rather than let them go or to live with their mother. Jones then took his daughter with him while he bought cigarettes and decided what to do next. So the child that he'd already strangled was left at home with the other children, but he took his daughter with him so that she couldn't raise the alarm. When he returned, he proceeded to strangle the remaining children one by one. His daughter even pleaded with him by saying, "Stop, Daddy, no, I love you." He reported having to use a belt on the 2 and the 3-year-old children because his hands were too big. He says that a demonic voice told him to kill the kids and told him that they were going to chop him up and feed him to the dogs. He then loaded all of their bodies into his SUV in black bags and covered them with blankets. He drove around with their bodies in the back for 9 days. He ate fast food and he bought synthetic cannabis. He covered about 700 miles over 3 states. During that time, his cell phone records shows that he called the babysitter to say that he was taking the kids and moving out of the state. He also went online to research ways to disintegrate a body faster and which countries wouldn't extradite him for murder charges. He made lists of steps to dismember and hide the bodies, as well as other ways to try to cover his tracks. He was captured at a Walmart buying saws, acid, a dust mask, goggles and a 5-gallon plastic bucket. However, he says that he couldn't go through with dismembering his own children. When the bodies started to decay, he poured bleach over them to try to mask the odour. He was only actually caught after he was pulled over by a policeman during a routine traffic check. The officer initially thought that he was intoxicated and said that he was acting aggressively. However, when he got closer to the vehicle, he smelled the decaying bodies. A search of the vehicle turned up synthetic marijuana along with more troubling items, the bleach, the acid, the children's clothing. Then, in the back of the SUV, they find a large puddle of blood and bodily fluids crawling with maggots. They also found handwritten checklists that included phrases like melt bodies and grind bones to sand. He was arrested immediately and taken into custody. Once Jones finishes his confession, he leads the police to an isolated area near the Alabama town of Pineapple, about 25 miles west. There, the children's badly composed bodies were wrapped inside garbage bags and they're found just off an abandoned dirt road. At his trial, he attempted an insanity defence, claiming that he had undiagnosed schizophrenia. He claimed that Amber leaving him to care for the children alone, despite the fact that he did actually take them from her, had put undue stress on his mental state, which he self-medicated with alcohol and synthetic cannabis. His defence claimed that he couldn't tell right from wrong at the time when he killed his children. Of course, the details of this crime are absolutely horrific and incomprehensible. Timothy Jones had a difficult and abusive upbringing. However, that is never an excuse to commit more horrific crimes. Others have suffered similar abuse and find a different way. They don't go on to murder. Jones claimed that he had undiagnosed schizophrenia and was self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. But searches on his phone and the written list in his car showed very clear signs of planning, as well as planning to get away with it after he disposed of their bodies. Using synthetic marijuana and alcohol is likely to amplify any anxious thoughts, which Jones was claiming was a demonic voice telling him to kill. He was an incredibly controlling person and had deep-set resentments. He'd shown that he was very quick to anger, and he'd beaten his wife and his children on several occasions. He wanted the power that he lacked during his childhood. He never developed an ability to empathise with others, and he lacked that emotional intelligence. Nobody had ever tried to develop this within him. The brain damage that he sustained is likely to have significantly contributed to this. Throughout his childhood, his thoughts, feelings and emotions spiralled out of control. He tried to mend any anxious and fearful thoughts with drugs and alcohol. When he found religion, he absolutely embraced it and took everything in the Bible literally. For somebody who has no idea how to manage their own life, their emotions, their thoughts, this structure and rigidity offers an attractive template on how to live. As an added bonus, the church gave its male members all of the power and control. He was finally in a position where he had control. Over the course of the years, he lost that power and control, and he found himself and his life unmanageable yet again. Only this time, he had his children that he could use as tools to hurt his ex-wife. I guess I could sum up this case by saying that dysfunctional homes produce dysfunctional children who grow into dysfunctional adults. If appropriate care, support and guidance isn't provided to these families, it can sometimes result in horrific crimes such as this. There are several well-documented instances where people have tried to raise concerns about him to the authorities. However, nothing much was ever done about it. Those children were not just killed by one man on his own. The system had also let those vulnerable children down. I do hope that you've learned something from today's case. I hope that you found it interesting. Thank you so much for watching then. Bye for now.